Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is a conversation with Marshal Kosloff and Meg Reiss. And Meg is talking about how to build resilient supply chains, the role of new technology in that, and a lot of talk about AI as well. It's one of those fascinating conversations that I know you all will enjoy. With that, on to the show.
Dr. Meg Reiss, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I think we should really kick off with your UT context and affiliation, but also your current role at SolidIntel.
First of all, Hookem. I am a proud UT alum. I actually graduated from my PhD program here. So I am absolutely thrilled to be back on campus, get to be in Austin, get to have some tacos and brisket while I'm here, ideally, although I haven't managed to either yet. So I have some really strong objectives for the rest of my time I'm in town. So very excited to be back. I am actually currently the founder and CEO of a company called SolidIntel. We are using generative AI to do supply chain illumination and de-risking. So that basically means that we are using these new tools that are available to developers to look at the upstream supply chain risks in companies as well as in the US government and see whether or not any bad actors are either in their upstream supply chain or affiliated with them, so that those folks that we're working with can take the steps to make changes before those bad actors lead to bad consequences.
Here's something I was wondering during your talk. Can you articulate the ideal vision of how generative AI can improve the supply chain transparency situation and compare that to what's the worst legacy status quo you're voting against?
Yeah. I'll start with what was possible before. And I'm going to give folks a lot of credit because this has only become a really, I'll say, sexy topic since COVID, even though the long-term and geopolitical and geostrategic interests of getting supply chains right have existed for a very, very long time, even when the topic wasn't sexy. So what has historically been the supply chain de-risking tools of the trade are using things like bills of lading and then looking at giant spreadsheets, comparing them against other risk factors, and then basically building out scores on how risky those specific supply chains are based on those scores that you develop. And what generative AI has allowed us to do is take both structured and unstructured data and have it talk to each other for the first time, and basically create workers that go out and try to find information to build into those risk factors. So what are we able to do that wasn't possible before? Well, we're able to, yes, look at those structured data sets and have them talk to each other. But we're also able to pull in information that we as researchers did not have access to before and build out these threat profiles in a way that could never be done prior. So we've been able to very, very quickly, very rapidly build out the ability to see things like Chinese military SOEs, problematic investors in your upstream supply chain, things that can keep you from being able to import your goods into the US or sell into the US government. And we can do it both from the national security threat side, but also the human rights side, which is like a really big boon to be able to identify, are we seeing things like Uyghur forced labor end up in your upstream, and make sure that companies can do both the right thing and what's good for US national security, but also what's good ethically and morally.
Speaking of ethics and morality, I'm sure you've seen this in the news. The China Select Committee out of Congress has released a new report on venture investment into China. And you brought this up in terms of the supply chain transparency. I feel as if you're in the market side of these issues, you woke up one day and all of a sudden you had to care about supply chains. And all of a sudden, you now have to care about where your investors are coming from. Can you talk about the geopolitical angle of how market-oriented forces are kind of having to confront a new space here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a really interesting report. And I just give a lot of kudos to the staff and the members who were active in that space. And I will be forwarding this talk to them so that they know I gave them kudos because I got to talk to them after it came out. So actually, one of the things our tech does is look at problematic investors, scale of the investments, the way the cap table plays out. And when it comes down to it, it always should have been a huge concern. I think there were decisions that investors made on, say, were you willing to invest in a company that was doing facial recognition in China? Well, we know starting in 2008, after the Olympics, that facial recognition was used as a tool of repression very, very early in China. And they used this in order to essentially prevent people from going about daily life, making sure they weren't pursuing their religious or political or other aspirational goals in life. And so there were choices made by folks in pretty problematic ways, but seeing large market sizes. Well, this committee report is essentially shedding light on some of that. It's not saying it's illegal. It wasn't illegal at the time, even though some of those investments may be really problematic now. But it was always wrong. And so I think that's where this is coming. And now that we're seeing that some of these tools or investments that were made back then could potentially be used in a dual use capability. So this military civil fusion in China, we've known about it for a really long time. The question of whether or not these investments or future investments could be used by civil military fusion companies means that you're at that point choosing whether or not you're on the side of the US or on the side of an authoritarian country that's kind of set on a really bad trajectory that comes in conflict with US strategic goals. So it's going to force investors and other folks into a position of having to choose in at least some cases. So investors are going to need to be a lot more strategic when it comes to the Chinese market.
I think that's a great pivot to the talk you just delivered here at UT. It's called Unraveling the Threads, China, Geopolitics, and Supply Chain Threats. Obviously, you can't summarize the CW on those incredibly complicated set of issues, but just give a quick summary for the listeners of what you were focused on.
Absolutely. So I really start the talk with talking about what keeps me up at night. And when it comes down to it, I just fundamentally believe that you need to track and look at what authoritarians tell you they want to do. So if you have a country like China telling you that they really are intent on reuniting with Taiwan, as they call it, in my view, it would be attacking Taiwan. You need to listen to them, especially if all of the other indicators tell you that they're very serious about the topic. So what I do is I lay out where the Chinese tell us they want to go vis-a-vis Taiwan, how they're building up their military capabilities to get there, how they're changing their internal structures to make sure that they can sustain any economic or military response by the US and the international community, and how they've used their economic might to pressure other countries to kind of frame the importance of the supply chain issue to the US and the importance of our long-term strategic goals. I then turn into the historical importance of this topic, starting with an example from World War II on the rubber industry, which was a really, really problematic chokehold once we lost access to natural rubber, and actually potentially could have even delayed, according to one academic, Alexander Field, our incursion onto Europe's soil by as much as a year, which of course means millions of deaths. And so the importance there, I turn to the importance of supply chains in the US and what any sort of Taiwan invasion scenario means for the long-term health of the US economy, as well as how to ensure the health of DoD's supply chains and make sure that we can do deterrence as well as operations that we need to be able to do.
I'm glad you brought up the rubber example from Alexander Field's book, because I think it gets at the core of where your career's gone, and I think where it's going, in the sense that on the one hand, one could say, okay, so if you're concerned about rubber or production or resources, you should go work at the China Select Committee and write a report, or go be a national security advisor to a senator like you did in the past. Yet you're working in the private sector on this problem very directly. Can you say, A, kind of what the motivation looks like between choosing in those spaces, but B, what that says about how our system chooses to confront publicly minded problems like the supply chain one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a really awesome job and career in government. I was very, very lucky to be working under people like Senator Romney. And one of the things that he really instilled in some of us was the importance of a strong public sector and private sector at the same time. Both have to work hand in hand for a strong U.S. economy, but also national security objectives. They both have to be strong. And so I kind of got deeper into the weeds on the supply chain issue and realized that it was a really interesting intersection of public and private sector as well as geopolitics. And so I moved into developing my own tech company because I thought there was a tool missing that would be able to better link these things. And there are some tools on the market. I'm not saying there aren't, although we are the first mover in generative AI, which I love to tell people about. But when it comes down to it, the more companies understand their risk and are able to take steps before any big problematic event would happen that would disrupt supply chains, the more you're going to have a stronger and survivable sector of the economy that can get through a disruptive event like a rupture event between the Chinese and the US markets. And I think the US government side, it's getting stronger. They understand the risks. They're going to be moving forward. They can also use tools and are really reaching out to the private sector to make sure that they're using all the tools at their disposal to understand this stuff as well.
Quick sidebar. Speaking of AI, UT has designated 2024 the year of AI. Just to ask, what's your big perspective on AI, its potentials, promise, fear? Let's get the editorial perspective on that.
Absolutely. I think that coming from DC, we're seeing a lot of AI discussions turn into worst case scenario discussions. And then in Silicon Valley, you're seeing a lot of AI discussions turn into, what the potential is. And we need a really strong bridging of these two. We don't want to regulate ourselves out of existence. We're stronger on generative AI than, say, the Chinese models because we're able to access all of the information and use all of the tools at our disposal to get there. We probably do need some level of restrictions or support from the government once we start touching into really hard defense tech or, some bio-related stuff. But without the government supporting exploration in this field, we're going to be hamstringing ourselves. So I'm a bit of a techno optimist while recognizing the real threat scenario out there. And I something that really worries me is the potential for overregulation based on the extreme examples that are fairly low likelihood of happening as compared to the way the majority of the companies are trying to build out in a way that will really strengthen the U.S. economy as well as our friends and allies.
Back to the presentation you gave, I especially appreciated one of your first slides, which was focused on the role of history. Obviously, that's near and dear to the heart of the Clements Center, but it focused on how the leaders of our authoritarian rivals, Russia, China, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, are especially interested in long-running, centuries-long history when they're coming to their positions on Ukraine, Taiwan, et cetera. Love you just kind of expand on this point and why you thought it was the relevant slide to kind of open your presentation with.
This is something that I come back to over and over when thinking about why leaders in these countries are willing to put blood and treasure on the line. It's not the way that I think, and it's not the way that the American ethos is. We're a pretty forward-looking country. We're very young. We're very optimistic. We think that we can and will do good in the world. But when it comes down to it, Putin, Xi, these authoritarian countries have spent a lot of time digging into archives to try to regain what used to, in their view, what used to be their role in the world. You've literally seen archives come under Putin, and then he will spend, apparently talking to U.S. political reporters and an extraordinary amount of time talking about revisionist history to justify why he's willing to kill millions of people for returning to Russian greatness. and Russian greatness in a way that wasn't real in history. But as long as he can justify it, he can claim it's true. Well, the Chinese do the exact same thing. They go through archives, they look at maps. If you have even a mistaken island drawn into a sea that they claim that was theirs at one time, they'll lay claim over this false island. And so this view of history, this view of returning to the rightful place becomes part of the ethos, and it becomes part of the strategy, the goal. It's the thing that moves their people forward. And so we need to think seriously if you're seeing claims about things like history, claims about ownership or control of people that live abroad just because they're ethnically Russian or ethnically Chinese, then you need to think seriously about what that means for the long-term strategies of those countries.
I think the way you set this up kind of gives us two kind of ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, and Vladimir Putin is doing his interview with Tucker Carlson. In the past week or so, he's focused on like the year 900 and the year 1100. And I think even Tucker was kind of giving a couple eye rolls to that conversation because that isn't just a productive way to have a policy discussion. On the other hand of the spectrum, though, you have the United States where we're having these debates about Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel, the Middle East, and very clearly these are policy debates that I would argue are over-informed by we're still adjudicating our response to 9/11, and we're not actually debating how would you actually protect Taiwan? How should Israel behave in Gaza? How does the war in Ukraine end? When instead we're just, once again, going over recent history that we still haven't really settled. What does a middle point kind of look like? Not focusing on 2003 too much, but also not bringing 900 into the conversation.
Yeah, I think the Clements Center strikes the right balance on this. It's current strategy, current objectives informed, but not dictated by history is where you have to go. If you don't look at historical lessons, you're going to be doing all of this blind. If you don't look at the historical ties or even have basic understanding of the role history plays to these various actors, you won't understand where they're coming from. So you have to know and you have to be informed by it. But what is possible? History may inform what is possible, but it does not dictate where you should go. And so that's generally my view. We try to bring in, when I worked for the senator, we brought in history into legislation. We would look at different successful ways of doing things and how it could actually creatively inform the legislative process today. But did we just try to replicate the wheel? No, because circumstances are different.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting to what you just said is you brought up how Senator Romney approached questions of history. My next question is actually going to be, sitting in like the literal halls of power in Washington, to what degree, obviously, most senators and reps are not at Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin levels of like history engagement. But what degree do you think like the study of history is shaping decision-making around the big questions of today?
Secretary Schultz used to do this Saturday book club, essentially, with other leaders where they would read books, they'd talk about ideas, they'd think through these things. Do I see that happening all the time? At the member level, I actually don't know if it's happening, but I can tell you that I'm in a very nerdy book club with a bunch of folks at DOD and from like staffers from Congress. And we look at the economic and industrial efforts during World War II and what that means for a potential China conflict. So it definitely does inform. I mean, I'm kind of right at that intersection of history and politics. So maybe I know the 10 people who care about this, but maybe there's more. I will say that I worked for two members in the Senate, Senator Sass from Nebraska, who was previously affiliated with the LBJ School as well as a professor, and then Senator Romney. Both of them were definitely informed by history. I'll say Senator Romney still has previous Clements Center director Will Inboden's book on Reagan sitting on his bookshelf because these lessons are so important for understanding what's happening today.
And you kind of hinted at this with your reference to World War II mobilization, but what is some recent or near past history that's shaping your perspective on these geopolitical supply chain, China-Taiwan questions?
I think I have a tendency to look at World War II a lot in just kind of understanding what happens when things go wrong, which is really helpful in informing what sort of things do you need to ask and understand today that would have been helpful then. So it's really helpful for me to look all the way back then. Cold War is my bread and butter. It's a lot of what my PhD dissertation was on, for instance. So that's always stuff that I draw into my current work. But also just looking at the change in ways that leaders talked in changing societies. So when we look about Hu Jintao or go back to Deng Xiaoping and see how they talk differently or the same as Xi Jinping now, you will detect changes in policy and trajectory of the Chinese strategy as a result of those comments.
I'm really glad that you brought up World War II as an example of where to study and focus on, because for I think a long time it was a cliche to reference World War II, the good war. Obviously, it's the war you go to, but if we're actually looking at the questions facing policymakers, the tech industry, political debates around isolationism, they actually do rhyme at a helpful level. So I hope folks don't just think of that as a obvious cliche to go under. In this last section, I think it'd be great to kind of just go over the quick arcs of your career, because I think there are a lot of folks in the audience who are going to follow that. So you've done three, I think, big things that are categorically obvious here: academia, your work in Congress, also the legislative branch, and of course now the tech industry. Would love to just go run through all three, with also emphasis on the Clements Center part, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. So I was very, very lucky to start my career working under Secretary Shultz's team at the Hoover Institution, working on Asia use of force policy. So I just kind of got thrown in almost surprisingly into working with some of the greatest leaders in recent history and getting to learn from them. That actually informed my initial career trajectory, as well as my understanding of geopolitics. I got an LLM and then ended up at the LBJ school and was just very lucky to work under Professor Will Inboden. Clements gave me a lot of insight and gave me the opportunity to do archival work as well as interacting with great policy folks. And it's very unique around the country to have such support for students, even at the PhD level. PhD programs are, of course, judged by how many academics they produced. But I had such strong support through Clements, as well as the LBJ School, Strauss Center, et cetera, for becoming the best possible practitioner. And that's an unusual thing to have happen. So I will never stop being grateful for them for supporting that career path. Then I ended up in government. First, I worked for Senator Sass from Nebraska, and then Senator Romney as his NSA, and got to have a role and a place at the table and support someone who is wanting to do really big things in national security, really wanting to get it right, to set up the next generations for being successful here. And when it came down to it, there were big, tumultuous things that happened while I was working for him. Ukraine is a really obvious example. The senator had really strong instincts on pushing for weapons delivery and different types of support for the Ukrainians, even when it made others sheepish. And I'll be forever grateful that we got to play in that space and play a role in helping the Ukrainians stave off these aggressors. And then, the reason he hired me was to work on the China challenge. And he was the ranking member of the China subcommittee, or the Asia subcommittee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So we got to do a lot of work and figure out a lot of legislative initiatives, work with a lot of our friends and allies around the world to strengthen these ties, to put the U.S. in the best possible position to deal with this emerging and resurgent aggressive power in this area.
Yeah, and I think the last big question, really, I'm interested in the fact that you obviously have an area of expertise as an academic, but kind of, if you look at the tech industry where you and I both work, oftentimes the best founders are not experts in their fields, actually know nothing at all. Travis Kalanick knew nothing about the cab industry before he got into Uber, insert Elon Musk, in a variety of different industries. How do you balance the fact that you're an expert with the fact that you also need to build a company?
Yeah, it's a fun place to be. When it comes down to it, this is a space that if you got it wrong by not bringing expertise into the area, I actually think it would be bad. I'm very lucky that VCs and others that I've gotten to work with that seem excited about our company. They're excited about it because of the expertise, not despite it. They see a vision of how to make our private sector and our public sector better through tech like mine. And so we're building we're building because of the expertise, not despite it. And there's a movement in this dual use space right now where I think drawing in expertise is finally being supported. I'm not saying it wasn't before. There were places where people got it, but this is a space that if we get it wrong, there are really big consequences. And so the more we can bring in the right folks who understand where this is going, the better. If you look at a really innovative company like Anduril, Palmer Luckey, not the world's leading expert in geopolitics, but he brought in Chris Brose very, very early into that company, who was McCain's right-hand guy and the staff director for the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Chris understood very, very well where DoD needed to go because he had worked in this space directly. And so you're seeing really innovative folks make sure that they're surrounded by the right people who see the need and then can bring the vision and meld them together. And I think that's what we're trying to do with SolidIntel.
And I think the closing question here, it was useful for me to bring up Travis Kalanick as a counterexample to expertise versus company building, because that was a different era of Silicon Valley. I think Uber was on the, side of this is useful, this is obvious, but there's also the side of, hey, you're just building a B2B SaaS company. You don't need to be an expert, just code for 20 hours a day and get it done. In this new era where tech is clearly pivoting to attacking big problems that are clearly related to the national interest, such as yours, can you see an emerging playbook starting to come together, or any just advice you'd give for other folks, whether they're founders looking for maybe a co-founder who has expertise, maybe you're a Palmer looking for a Christian Brose, what are just the key takeaways that they should think about?
Absolutely. I think that we want to make sure that we're building what's needed, not what the founder thinks would be great. And that's where the expertise parts comes in. So when you have practitioners who have worked in a space and see where there's a failure point, that's when you have the potential to really strike gold, essentially. I started my company because we were having companies tell us that they didn't know their upstream supply chains well enough to comply with the regulatory environment that the Senate was passing at the time. So it wasn't really a question to me that a market existed, because basically they were telling us, there is a market for this. We need this fixed. We don't know how to do this thing. When it comes to hard defense tech, there are folks at the Pentagon who could envision a world where a certain type of tech existed and it would make their lives fundamentally better. It would protect the warfighter. It would be able to push on it could do all of these things. And we envision in an ideal world, this thing that doesn't exist yet should exist. Making sure that you marry those visionaries with the programmers and the engineers, the people who can develop the hard tech, so that they get what needs to happen, not what someone in Silicon Valley would say, this would be nice if they had it. I bet we can get DoD to buy it eventually. We just need to marry those visions.
Yeah, that's the perfect place to close, because I was joshing with you before the recording started about, hey, if you'd left Senator Romney's office in, September of 2021 at the height of the pre-Christmas supply chain crunch, that would have been a really sexy time to launch a company. But you pointed out the tech wasn't quite there. So you can't just have the narrative. You have to have your capabilities as founder, but also just the actual part being here. And AI seems to be that really 10Xer that you're looking for. So it's good to hear you're serious about that. Meg, thank you for joining me on Horns of a Dilemma.
Always great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.